Good. Now, I want to give everyone a fair warning here that there is a lot of content we're going to go over. We have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to move quickly. And let's try to save questions for the end. If you have something burning, raise your hand. But let's, for the most part, try to save the questions for later. And I will do my best to cover everything. Okay, so EAC2 is for rating systems, new construction, core and shell, schools, healthcare, and retail. And this is the on-site credit for these rating systems. It does not talk about off-site green power reps, anything like that at all. Now, what's special about EAC2 is that we're talking about offsetting a portion of your cost. So the other credits, 6 and 4, are about offsetting your usage. This one is specifically about cost. So it's important for people to know the difference. There are a lot of points available, up to 8 points for on-site. And the calculations, so either you'll have a model and you'll have that from EAC1, or you can use default cost data from the Commercial Buildings and Energy Consumption database. Okay, so there are 3 requirements for EAC2. Where net metering is possible, you're required to have the systems deliver back to the grid any surplus electricity that the building doesn't consume. Yeah. The second requirement is that only energy that's actually consumed by the building is available or counts towards what you're offsetting. So if whatever you're delivering back to the grid in the case of net metering, you wouldn't be able to count that towards the percentage that you're offsetting when you're calculating your points. Also important to notice. Now this third point, that the reps must be retained or retired, we'll sort of get more into that, what that actually means later. But just keep that in mind. Okay, so I do want to step back for a second. There are some sheets in the middle and the center of every table. Those are what we call 3 degrees, kind of like cheat sheets. They sort of summarize the percentages. There's not enough for everyone, but hopefully that's friends and share. So let's just follow along. One side is about offsite, and one side is onsite. So we're on the onsite. So you can just kind of reference that. What percentage of your cost you need to offset for 100 points for what rating system? Okay. So that is EAC2, onsite for new construction, core and shell, schools, healthcare, and retail. EAC6 is for the same rating systems. It's new construction, core and shell, schools, healthcare, and retail. But instead of on-site green power, we're now talking about off-site green power. And that is what that means. We'll talk about in a second. Now, unlike EAC2, we're talking about electricity use. What percentage of your use are you offsetting by purchasing green power? Not quite as many points are available, but up to 6. So instead of up to 8. And the way you calculate it is just the same. You're either going to have the data from EAC1, or you're going to use the default consumption figures from the Department of Energy's CVEC database. Okay, so the one really important requirement to keep in mind is that you're purchasing at least 35% of the annual usage over a 2-year period. So you can purchase up to 100%. You must purchase at least 35%, but must purchase enough green power to cover 35% of the building's usage over a 2-year period. Now, you have 3 options for where do you get this green power? Where does it come from? So first, you can your first option is a Greenie accredited utility program. Now, I know that there's Dominion in Virginia and Ameren in St. Louis. Has one. I know that Duke Energy also has a North Carolina Green Power Program. I'm not sure the certification of it. So you guys are familiar with the box you're able to check. So effectively, where there's a Greenie accredited utility program, that's kind of where on your bill sometimes you see a little box that says, check here if you want to buy green power. That's what we're talking about in option 1. Is everyone familiar with what that is? The Greenie, at least the accredited utility utility programs? Yeah. Okay, great. Yes, I saw lots of head nodding. That makes me happy. Okay, so option 2 is to purchase a Greenie certified competitive power. So if you live in Texas, for example, where you can shop your electricity, you can decide, I want to purchase my electricity from a green power provider. And if that provider is Greenie certified, then that would be another option for you. The third option, regardless of where you live, is to purchase Greenie certified renewable energy certificates. Again, we'll define those a little bit more in a few minutes. Are we all with me? Yeah? Okay. Okay, EAC4. Here we go. Refers to commercial interiors and existing buildings. Now, EAC4 is a little different because it handles the on-site and the off-site credit, on-site and off-site power under the same credit. So now, for commercial interiors, you can't, LEED doesn't allow on-site. And that sort of makes intuitive sense because typically what we're talking about is, occupying a floor, one entire floor in an office building. You can't really install make changes to the mechanical system or install a PV system on your own floor. So it makes intuitive sense that LEED doesn't allow on-site for commercial interiors. But for existing buildings, absolutely. Now, for either CI or EV, off-site is allowed. Now, we're talking about electricity. Well, you're offsetting electricity and energy use, like EAC 6. It's energy use, not energy cost. But what's special is that for existing buildings, we're talking about offsetting your entire energy use, not just electricity. So any natural gas, for example, that's combusted on site, you would need to offset the emissions or the use from that. And that's unique to existing buildings. And what's also special about EV version 2009, you have to specifically use carbon offsets to address your natural gas use. Previous versions, you can kind of back out the calculations and purchase RECs, but for 2009, you must purchase carbon offsets. So just important to know. There are up to 6 points possible. And the calculation, so if it's a commercial interior, and it's sub-meter, then you're going to have your data and you calculate either 50 or 100%. If you don't have your data, which is more often the case, you use a LEED specified default figures of 8 and 16 kilowatt hours per square foot. For existing buildings, you are going to have a statement of energy performance for Energy Star. So you'll have your numbers. So it'll be pretty easy. Now, requirements and options. So for CI, you have to, as I just said, purchase either 50 or 100% of actual usage, or use the 8 and 16 default figures. Yeah. And for existing buildings, you're covering from 25 to 100%. Unlike here, where we're talking about 35% to 100%. With existing buildings, we're talking about 25 to 100%. Yeah? Good. Okay. So as I mentioned, the existing building credit is a little different in that it handles on-site and off-site renewable energy under the same credit. So for new construction, for example, you could install a PV system, you could install panels and offset the remainder of the building's use with renewable energy certificates. And those would be handled by 2 separate credits. So that would be the on-site credit, EAC2, and it would be the off-site credit, EAC6, for new construction. But for existing buildings, it's on-site and off-site are handled in the same point. So EAC4. So say, for example, let's just run through a quick exercise. So say, for example, you installed a system and you were offsetting 3% of your use. And EAC4, even if it's on-site, we're offsetting use, not cost. 3% you're offsetting your installed system, covers 3% of your use, and you purchase RECs to cover 50% of the building's usage, you would get a total of 4 points. So if you're looking, does everyone kind of if you can look at that sheet that was on the tables, you can maybe sort of follow along and see where that comes from. Okay, so let's sort of dive into on-site renewable energy for a moment.
One second, is there any requirement that you get an on-site?
I'm sorry.
You have to get both on-site and renewable
and off-site
for that EAC tool?
That is an excellent question. No, you can do either. That was just an example. If you wanted to do both, which we really encourage, that's how you would, that the points sort of go together. Whereas in new construction, for example, you would be talking about EAC4 and EAC2 and EAC6 separately. EV, EAC4 handles it all together. Is that okay? Great. Okay, so if we're talking about on-site, these are the types of LEED sort of eligible types of on-site renewable energy. Here are some examples of what's not eligible for LEED points. So things like passive solar strategies or daylighting strategies wouldn't apply to this particular credit. So what we are talking about is on-site solar and geothermal and biomass and things of that nature. Okay. Now, all energy has pros and cons. Coal has pros and cons. Solar has pros and cons. RECs have pros and cons. So let's just take a few minutes and run through what they are briefly. And as I said, there are probably people in this room that know more than I do about this, and I'm sure would be happy to talk more about it after. So you are absolutely decreasing your grid purchase electricity. There is a financial payback over time. It's really visible. I know that I love walking into a building and seeing solar panels. It makes me feel like I'm supporting, or I'm going to a building that's thought about innovative design strategies. It makes me feel good. And you get a lot of points. Up to 8 points are possible. Now, there are some cons, of course, and those are upfront, high upfront costs, lengthy payback periods, sometimes unpredictable generation, and many site considerations. Okay, so if you decide to go through the on-site, there are some things you're going to want to consider that will work with a solar developer to sort of work through this list. You're going to think about owner motivation. You're going to be thinking about market incentives. In certain states, there are really effective incentives for solar. You're also going to be thinking about, where is the sun strong? And, I want to kind of interject here that this checklist it's not one thing that matters. It's all of these together, how they play together. Like, for example, in New Jersey. New Jersey has really great incentives to develop solar. Now, you wouldn't think of New Jersey as like a hotbed of solar, right? I mean, it's not Arizona or even California, but there's a high density solar in New Jersey, and that's because there's lots of other factors at play. It's not just where the fuel source is strong, for example. Okay, since we're short on time, I'm going to kind of blow through a few of these. So, the point here is that when we're talking about on-site renewable energy, we're talking mostly about credit 2. There are a lot of points available, and it's available for new construction, EV, corn shell, schools, healthcare, and retail. Again, not available for CI. So let's spend a few minutes talking about off-site. Now, again, you have 3 options. The first is in a closed electricity market, you can enroll in your Greenie accredited utility program. Right? We talked about that. That's where you check a box. In an open electricity market like Texas, you can shop your power, decide you want to purchase from a green power provider. In either case, you can purchase renewable energy certificates. So you've got 3 options for your off-site credits. Okay. Does this work? Wow. Okay. So, the question of the hour. What is a renewable energy certificate? All right. Now, Now, we're going to step back for a second. The way power is generated comes from all different kinds of sources, right? It comes from natural gas and coal facilities. It also comes from wind farms. And all of these facilities generate electricity, and the electrons get mixed together, dumped into the power pool, and then mixed around and sent and delivered to the end user. Now, once the electrons, an electron is an electron. You can't really tell which is the green one and which is the brown one. And once they're mixed in the power pool, you have no way to separate out the electrons that come from a wind farm from the electrons that come from a coal facility, for example. So this creates two problems. One is that the users can't say, I want only the green electrons. I only want to support those. Well, there's really no way to do that. And the second problem is for the generators, is that electricity is a commodity subject to kind of market, and the utility pays. Effectively, what's happening is that green power, whether we like it or not, is just still more expensive today. And prices have come down a lot, but it's still more expensive. So enter the renewable energy certificate. And what a renewable energy certificate is when 1 megawatt hour of green power is generated and delivered to the grid, 1 REC is created. And that REC is sort of the proof. It's a piece of paper, that says 1 megawatt hour of green power was sent to the grid. It's also the kind of the legal claim check of all of the environmental benefits associated with that 1 megawatt hour of electricity. So who here is familiar with FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council? Okay. So there's like a chain of custody, right, for wood products and things like that. And by creating this REC, it sort of allows things to be traced, and we'll talk more about how that actually manifests in a few minutes. But it's important to kind of keep that in mind. So what we at 3 Degrees do is we purchase large quantities of these RECs and we sell them to the end users. And what that does, and why it matters, is that we're basically providing, well, one, consumers a way to support green power, but we're also giving kind of long-term stability to these green power facilities. We enter into multi-year agreements, and that reduces the risk, and ultimately the revenue from these RECs makes the green power more price competitive with conventional sources of electricity. So it really does matter to these generators. The revenue from the RECs is an important piece of calculating the profitability of the green power. So that is what a REC is. Does everyone feel a little bit more comfortable with that? Okay. Good. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, every type of power has pros and cons, including green power. So some pros from the Green Accredited Utility Program, again, that's where you check a box. It's really simple to sign up. It's integrated into your monthly bill. You can often support regional green power, and sometimes there are marketing benefits associated with it. Now, the con is that it is more expensive, almost always. I can't say always, but almost always more expensive. It's not always available for 100%, sometimes it is, but not always. And it's often a month-to-month enrollment. The bundled electricity, so that's when you shop your electricity. If you live in Texas, you decide who you purchase your power from. It's combined in the same bill, makes things really easy and effective, or efficient. But you never really get any communication support. You're actually not typically supporting regional green power, and it's not always most cost-effective. Now, a REC, it's often the least expensive. The contracts are really simple, but it is. It's a simple contract. You do not alter your relationship with your utility. That's a question that we get a lot. How do RECs change? I have a great relationship with my utility, and RECs do not change that relationship. And you have the option to support specific locations and technologies. So you could say with a REC, I only want wind, or I only want Wisconsin wind, or I only want California solar. You can specify the technology and the geo. Now, it's a separate invoice, and you can't always source locally and regionally. It depends on the portfolio of the third party you're working with. Okay, so off-site renewable energy is mostly credit 6, sometimes credit 4, credit 2, but for the most part credit 6. You get a lot of points up to 6, not as many as on-site solar, like you get 8 with on-site, but still a lot of points available. Okay. So remember what we were talking about with off-site, with existing buildings. Version 2009 requires you to offset for example, the natural gas use. So not just the electricity use of the building, but the entire energy use. So, and version 2009 requires you to do that with a carbon offset. So, what is a carbon offset? I'm going to come back over here again. Okay. Now, a carbon offset is represents 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalents that are not emitted into the atmosphere as a result of an improvement over business as usual. So let's walk through what that looks like. Okay, so there's a, we're going to use ag methane as an example. So there's a dairy farm. Dairy farms have lots of cows that produce lots of manure. Now the business as usual case is that that manure gets sent into a manure pond or pool. And not necessarily most apt to any conversation about the line. But hopefully everyone's doing good. And that manure pond releases a lot of methane. And as you all probably know, methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. So what some facilities, what some dairy farmers do, one option is to install a digester. And what happens in this case, that digester is the improvement over the business as usual. What happens is instead of funneling the manure into just a pond to release the methane, open air, it sort of goes into this digester and prevents the methane from being released and destroys it and creates a flare, and there's a byproduct of a small amount of carbon dioxide. But essentially, by destroying the methane and flaring it, and even though there's a small byproduct of CO2, the sort of net result is that you're reducing the effect by 20 times. So for all of that reduction that's happening, you get a carbon offset. So how do we feel? Are there any specific questions right now, or do we feel like we understand that a little bit better? Yeah? Okay. Okay, so we've talked a lot about Greenie over the course of the last 40 minutes or so. And Greenie, essentially, I mean, they are the third-party verifier. A lot of people say, like, what are these recs? What are these offsets? How do I know they're real? And essentially what Greenie is doing is they are ensuring market integrity. They make sure there's no double counting, that there's no double selling, that if we buy 100 recs from Tatanka Wind Farm, we're only selling 100 recs. They sort of track that chain of custody of that renewable energy certificate and make sure that it's not doubled. So they're the verifier, and that's why you see their name come up a lot, because it's really important so everyone knows that there's not all this doubling and additionality happening. So that's it's important to kind of look for Greenie certified utility programs or Greenie certified renewable energy certificates. They play a really important role ensuring the market is real and legitimate. Okay, so let's go over some cost examples. So with just real quick. So utility program, typically, so let's look at a quick example. So for a typical 200,000 square foot office building, new construction 2009, at about 15 megawatt hours, or $15 a megawatt hour, we're talking about an increase of about $16,000. These are $16,000, and keep in mind these are really rough numbers. In the open electricity market, we don't even want to try to guess because it varies so much, and we're really just not in a position to make guesses. And a REC, as we mentioned, one of the pros of renewable energy certificates is that they're really cheap or cost effective. And at about $1 a megawatt hour for a typical same example, 200,000 square foot new construction versus 2009, we're looking at a added cost of just over $1,000, roughly. So these are some cost examples. All right. So what does this look like in real life? I mean, how does all this come together? Who's done it, and what have they done? So let's look at Adobe. Now, first, what Adobe did is they reduced their energy because the cheapest, cleanest, as you all know, form of electricity is a kilowatt hour that's never used. And Adobe did a really sort of aggressive job at implementing 70 different measures. Some really innovative. They retrofitted their entire HVAC system and installed lots of efficient lighting. And as a result of all these sort of separate measures, they reduced their electricity by 35% and their natural gas by 41%. So these are substantial reductions. We're not talking about 5% here and there. These are very substantial reductions, and made a big impact. So then they complemented all of those efficiency measures with some green energy. So they installed on-site renewable energy, some small wind turbines. Then, after all of that, after all the energy efficiency reductions, after installing some on-site renewable energy, what was left, they still had to purchase electricity. And what they did is they matched 100% of their facilities' electricity usage with RECs, and they said, we're going to go one step further, and we're going to match, all of our natural gas use with carbon offsets. So we like to talk about this case study because I think it's really representative of what a holistic strategy is. We're talking about energy efficiency reductions that you all design into your buildings. Then we installed some on-site solar, or not we, but they did, and then they used renewable energy certificates and carbon offsets. So together, all of those actions make this really robust strategy to address their entire footprint. So we like to talk about that. I think it's a good example of what's possible. And with that, I will open the floor to questions and say thank you. And Tiffany might jump up and help me sort of field some of the tough questions I know are out there. So thanks again.
You said something about having with the on-site credit, forfeiting your recs and or not selling your recs. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Right, okay. So the question for the webinar is, can we talk about what we were talking about, or earlier what I mentioned when I said you need to retain or retire the RECs for on-site generation. Now, when we talked about how the REC, the renewable energy certificate, is the legal right, it's the proof that the 1 megawatt hour is generated. It's also the legal right to say, green power, this represents that 1 megawatt hour. You can't count that megawatt hour as renewable energy towards what you're offsetting and then go and sell the REC. For example, you need to keep the REC that is associated with the generation, with the megawatt that you're using to offset your cost. Does that make sense?
If you get the points, then you can't sell your REC.
You can't, correct. You can't sell the RECs that are associated with the energy that are used to get the points. So if there's a surplus, for example, so say a building generates more than the building uses, the surplus you can absolutely sell. You just can't sell what you're using to count to get the points. Yeah?
There, you said someone is buying the RECs. Who is that that's buying all RECs out of contract? Individual
right.
facilities, or is there a clearinghouse?
Right. So now let's see. We have 3 degrees, for example. We have a big portfolio. At any given time, we have thousands of RECs in our portfolio and we work directly with those generators. So with, Tatango Wind Farm, for example, and on the Dakota border, North Dakota, South Dakota border. So we purchase RECs and then sell them. Some facilities sell their RECs directly. So there's not always a third party, but it's much more common.
You're making the market. You're the market maker. You're buying those.
Well, you all are. Yeah, I mean there is a sort of commercial market also. I really can't speak to that because I'm on the retail side. But for all like portfolio standards, for example, RECs are oftentimes a part of that, and so there's a whole separate kind of commercial market for utilities to and to meet RPS standards. But that is separate from the retail market. I mean, there's some interplay. Sure, let's just hit that. Yeah.
Can you give us an idea of how many RECs were created in 2010, or what's the outlook for 2011? And are those all American, or is this a global market?
Yeah, maybe Tiffany is better equipped to speak to that.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So she, what's your name? Lexi. Was looking for an estimate of about how many RECs were generated in 2011, for example, and were they all U.S., generated in the U.S.?
So in 2010, there were about 32 million megawatt hours of renewable energy certificates that were bought and sold across the various markets. And yes, RECs are a solely North American-based system as they're known here. So U.S. and Canada. However, Australia does have a bit of a market that started in the last couple of years, and Europe does as well. In Europe, they're called ROCs, which I'm not exactly sure what that works out to be. But yeah, as they're known now, it's primarily U.S. and Canada.
And you have another, yes.
Green Tea, is that a private industry or entity, or is that a government?
It is a nonprofit. It's part of the Center for It's part of the Center for Resource Solutions. It's a program of the Center for Resource Solutions, which is a nonprofit. So yes, the Center for Resource Solutions, CRS. So if you hear CRS, sometimes that's how people refer to them. Yes. Yeah, in fact.
So the carbon offset, is that based on the emissions for the state or the EPA's e-grid region, or is it national?
So the so the question is, are carbon offsets relative to emissions by the state or nationally? And so the offset is actually relative to that facility. So an offset is created when, for example, in the example we walked through, the AgMen, the dairy farm. Any emission reductions that are achieved as a result of an improvement, like installing the digester, that's what's creating the carbon offset relative to what the facility was emitting prior to the improvement. So the dairy farm was emitting, this much kind of greenhouse gases, and then they installed the digester, and now they're emitting this much greenhouse gas. They get offsets for all of that they reduced. So it's relative to their own emissions. Does that answer your question?
So if it's a building, though, and they're reducing their electricity usage, they can't get a carbon offset from that perspective, then?
So the second question is, if you reduce your energy usage, can you generate a carbon offset? There are some efficiency credits that have come about. The little bit of the danger there is that the verification, someone that actually goes in to prove that those reductions occur and what they result in. When you're looking at emissions for a building, you brought up e-grid. So has anyone heard that figure that name before, e-grid? So basically the US EPA has taken the country and divided it into regions according to the power mix in that region. So each region has an e-grid emissions factor for that region. So we said 1,500 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour nationally. If you look at places like the Pacific Northwest, with a lot of hydro, you're about 1,000 pounds of CO2. Somewhere like the Midwest, where there's a lot of coal, 1,900 pounds of CO2. So if you want to quantify what your emissions are for your grid purchased electricity, you can take a look at that e-grid data and say, if I use X number of megawatt hours, this results in about X metric ton of emissions. For natural gas, things of that nature, the EPA has conversion factors for kilograms of CO2 per MBTU that you can factor in to get your metric ton. So if you're looking at carbon offset, the unit of measure is always the same. It's 1 metric ton equals 1 carbon offset, regardless of how you got to that factor.
Now, what I'll just add to that is, so the kind of essence of your question was, does your building kind of create offsets? Is that a piece of it? And I think part of it, what's important is the verification, which Tiffany mentioned. So with carbon offsets, there's different verifying standards, but Greenie is one of them. So with renewable energy certificates, Greenie is the primary kind of they're the ones who verify all of the recs. With carbon offsets, you want to do the exact same thing, and there are different certifying organizations. And so that's probably, that's a big piece of why facilities, they have relationships with these certification organizations. Yeah?
One quick question about the RECs. There's no difference in the quality of REC. In other words, solar, wind of the same quality. There wouldn't be you wouldn't have to pay more for solar REC versus wind.
So, okay, so the question is there a difference in quality between solar RECs and wind RECs, for example? And in terms of emission, in terms of the environmental benefit, no, because a REC represents a 1 megawatt hour of clean electricity that's generated. And Greenie has determined what those eligible sources of green power are. And so those are all equal in that way. Now, there's a cost difference associated with different types of RECs. So solar tends to be more expensive than wind, for example, because there's less of it. That's more or less. There's also, you can do, there are RECs that are kind of national, like Greenie Any, what they're called, and that's a mix. It's lots of different types of renewable energy that might make up that 1 megawatt hour.
But the incentive to buy a more expensive REC, what would be the incentive for somebody to buy a more expensive REC?
That's a good question. I mean, the story that you want to tell, or your motivation, or what you want, do you want to support, only solar, things like that. Well, another reason might also be if you want to support regional, if location is really important to you, certain types of energy might be more available. Yeah.
If I understood the slide correctly, you had an example of the cost per megawatt hour or something of buying green power versus buying a REC. And it was like $16,000 versus $1,100 or something like that. Was that a true comparison of two options? And if so, can you account for the cost difference?
Yes. So let's go back to that slide. Is this is what you're talking about? Right. Okay. So again, these are estimates, but $15 per megawatt hour to sign up in a utility green power program is not even, that's not the most expensive out there. There are more expensive, megawatt hours of green power, significantly more expensive than that. So that's in some ways a conservative estimate. $15 per megawatt hour. RECs right now, they're really cost effective and they're about $1 a megawatt hour. So it's the same. We're talking about the same numbers. We're just applying $50 per megawatt hour versus $1.
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah. So just to back up a little bit, it sounded like you were getting moving a little bit towards whether or not you're actually purchasing the green power specifically through a utility program. So just to point out, regardless of whether or not you're participating in a utility program or buying from a third party, it's still REC, so there's a key feature. Because as we mentioned, the utility is going to have a mixed grid. And so they're going to be generating a certain number of megawatt hours of green power. And in order to say to the customer, you bought X number of megawatt hours of green power, they have to retire and retain those RECs, much like you would do for the on-site solar. So a REC is a REC, depending on where you look at it. It's just how it's treated. The cost difference has to do with a lot of different factors. In many cases, the utility programs have spent a lot of marketing dollars, and they're really trying to target residential customers and a whole range of them. So some of it is just purely to try to get the word out there and to get the enrollment rates up. Most often, the utility programs are either retiring recs that they've already generated, or they're sourcing regionally. And regional recs tend to have a higher cost factor depending on where you're located. So those are just kind of some of the key things that go into the pricing.
And one more thing that I would add is that what's nice about utility programs is that it allows individual consumers to sign up. I know I can't speak for other rec providers, but I know we don't sell to individuals. So we won't sell you one rec. And the utility power program allows individuals to sign up. So that's one advantage of that program. Yes.
As I understand it, basically recs are underwriting the R&D and the escalated costs of alternative energy. So if right now 3.6% of energy use is renewable, how many recs do you have to sell to affect that number? That is like 1 million times what's being sold now, or are we getting close? I hear a lot of oversight of the process, but not a lot of accountability for the reporting of the results.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that chart has actually, it's grown a little bit. So in 2004, renewables was 2% of the pie, now it's 3.6. I mean, it's kind of pathetic in the big picture of things, but there has been some growth. And it's both the voluntary market and the compliance market that are going to be responsible for increasing the capacity. So as she mentioned, Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS for short, there's 29 states currently that have said, you know what, federal government has not taken a real initiative on this, and they passed their own RPS standards. And that's where the state says, okay, big utilities, by 2020, 20% of your generation must be from renewable sources, and then that ramps up. So then you've got that interplay where the utilities have to scramble to increase their generation. In some case, they're taking recs regionally as well, which creates the supply and demand relationship with the voluntary market. So unfortunately, I can't put a pinpoint number of how many recs that you would need to sell to increase the overall capacity. But that kind of relationship where there's a market demand that's signaling, hey, people are willing to pay more for this, that this is important for a number of reasons, will encourage and incentivize more generators to come online because they see, well, they may not be the loss anymore if they can sell their recs. And then, as a result, for example, we've seen prices come down because a whole bunch of new supply came on in the last couple of years as a result of more states passing renewable portfolio standards and more corporate purchasers entering the market. So it is growing. I mean, it's little and we'd like it to grow faster. There's no hard science to it, but you want to do whatever you can to encourage and incentive.
I think that's an important point, that recs right now they have not always been this cheap. In the past, they've been much more expensive. And so that, as Tiffany just mentioned, is in part, it's pretty complicated, but in part because renewable energy is subject to supply and demand, and a lot of supply came on in part because of the rec market. So while that's a soft answer, I think I feel pretty confident that the supply that recs met.
Great. Thank you very much.